Joining us now is Dr. Scott Gottlieb, former FDA commissioner. He's also a CNBC contributor, sits on the boards of Pfizer and Illumina. Always good to have you on a Friday afternoon, Dr. Gottlieb.
Thanks a lot.
April for all Americans. Is that realistic in your view, having been inside the FDA and knowing what kind of process and procedure this all has to go through?
Well, I think there's a distinction between when we might have the available supply in terms of the manufacturing of the vaccine, which is going to ramp sharply as we get into 2021, and when the vaccine may be licensed for general use. I think in terms of when the vaccine may be licensed for general use for general population, that's potentially an event that could take place in the first half of 2021, probably towards the later end of that range, potentially in the first quarter. But I think that that's exceedingly optimistic. And so I would be setting as a base case that we could potentially have a vaccine licensed for general use towards the back end of the first half of 2021, so the second quarter at some point. You're going to want at least 6-month follow-up data on most of the patients in the clinical trial, and probably longer than that before you're going to license it for a general population. You could see an emergency use authorization. I think you will see an emergency use authorization if the vaccine is demonstrated to be safe and effective in these ongoing clinical trials for special populations that are at higher risk of the consequences of COVID or at higher risk of contracting COVID, for example, healthcare workers. That you could see potentially in 2020. And I think what the FDA is likely to do is expand that emergency use authorization for other groups of people who are at similarly high risk for contracting COVID or having a bad outcome. But in terms of a general broad availability, I don't think that that's going to come till the back end of the first half of 2021.
So April's optimistic. Also wanted to ask you about the CDC's U-turn. Again, now recommending in their guidance that asymptomatic people who've been exposed to COVID-19 get tested. When they pulled that in August, there was an outcry from a lot of doctors, I think including yourself, that asymptomatic people have to be tested. You know, from day one, the CDC has really come out with some mixed messages and questionable messages from day one, where they only allowed people from China to get tested, when in retrospect that was crazy because all these sick people weren't even getting tested because they didn't have the right guidance. What is going on inside the CDC, and how much of their credibility is in question?
Well, I think the initial guidance, when you think back to February and March, when they were restricting access to testing based on people who were either coming from affected areas like China or in close contact with someone who is known to have the infection, and that was the guidance that was maintained in February and through parts of March. I think that really was an attempt to try to ration testing because it just wasn't an available supply of testing. Now that we have access to tests, it's more accessible in the commercial marketplace. We really should be using widespread testing as a way to try to control the epidemic. So testing and tracing, tracking people who might have been exposed to infection are core principles of trying to control epidemic spread in this kind of an environment. So the guidance that the CDC issued today, I think, is the right guidance. I think they landed in the right place. And this is what doctors, by and large, are doing and what states and cities are recommending.
Dr. Gottlieb, are you worried about the pickup in cases in Europe? And is there anything the U.S. can learn from the causes and the factors around those pickup in cases?
Yeah, I'm very worried about it. I think as we enter the fall and the winter, there's a real risk that we're going to see an upsurge in cases. This is a respiratory pathogen that typically would circulate in the fall and the winter. It's a coronavirus. The other known coronaviruses, the 7 known strains of coronaviruses, typically only circulate in the winter. And so we're entering the season when this virus wants to spread. I think that's part of what's happening in Europe. There was some relaxation in some of the tactics that they were employing to try to control the epidemic. And I think populations around the world, including the United States, are somewhat exhausted by what we've been going through. And people are backing off a little bit. And so I think we just need to be vigilant. We need to continue to wear masks. We need to continue to use testing and tracing as tools to try to control spread. I don't think that we're going to have to reach back to the kinds of shutdowns that we had in April or May. We shouldn't have to do that. We should have better tactics for trying to control spread and targeting interventions better in areas that are having epidemics rather than sort of widespread shutdowns. But, you know, we have one more cycle, I think, to get through with this virus before we can get into 2021, hopefully see it dissipate somewhat on its own, and then get a vaccine entering into the fall 2021 when this wants to become epidemic again.
At this point, as we wait the vaccine, we were supposed to have these monoclonal antibody treatments as the bridge to the vaccine, though it seems like the vaccine is moving even faster than that. What happened to those? Lilly had some news on it. It was kind of mixed, and there was a lot of hope for Regeneron's antibody cocktail. What happened to that bridge?
Well, the trials have enrolled a little bit more slowly than people anticipated because there's so many clinical trials going on competing for patients, and there's a lot of patients enrolling, a lot of trials enrolling patients and never going to really yield an important result. And so we should have focused recruitment on the trials that are with the most important therapeutics, including these antibodies. Lilly had data, I believe, last week that looked encouraging. And Regeneron hopefully will have data soon. I think Lilly's data actually came out this week. That looked encouraging. I think one or more of these antibodies should be successful. They're going to be important advances as we get into the fall.